All right, so in this video, we're going to begin to talk about page layout, and there's a number of different page layout methodologies. One of the first ones we're going to talk about is traditional float layout. And one of the key factors in traditional float is working with a variety of different box elements, and you'll see that we want to use this idea of floating the boxes to get them to align a certain way within our web page. And so even in this graphic here, you'll see that there's three boxes. You see that, and that creates our three columns here. So column 1, column 2, and column 3. But essentially, you have these three boxes in the midst of another box, which if you see here with this orange outline, and that's where we began to create our columns. We may have a header and a footer, and we're going to use float a lot to create page layout. But just to do a quick review over box modeling, here's a code pen that you can reference, and I'll save this here. And if you want to reference this again at a later time, you can go to this URL. But here's my HTML, and then here's my CSS. We just represent one box here. We gave this box a width of 250 and a height of 250 pixels, and we gave it a border of 250, 2 pixels solid black. As a quick review, margin is the active white space outside of the box element. So if we say margin and we say 50 pixels, or let's say 20 pixels, right? That's the active white space outside of the box element. So everything that's outside of this border, right? But if we say padding, watch what happens to the text in this box here. The padding is the active white space between the text and the border of the box element. And so you say padding, let's say 15 pixels. You'll see that there's going to be 15 pixels between the border and the text. And like I said, padding and margin are two properties that you'll use to kind of create space within your web layout. And you'll see this used often when we begin to implement page, when we begin to do page layout, whether that's CSS Flexbox or CSS Grid. We'll use padding and margin to give space to our box elements, or provide space within the box element. So that's a quick example, but like I said, this is just one box here. So now what we're going to do is begin to look at multiple boxes to achieve page layout and begin to give our site structure, right? So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to skip back a few slides here to traditional float layout. And what I want to do is I want to achieve this look and feel here in this graphic that you see on this slide, where we have three columns: the nav, the article, the sidebar, and then we have the header and the footer. And like I said, the reason why box modeling is so important is because essentially what you see here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boxes that we're going to begin to give structure to, and we're going to be using width and height. We're going to use a property called float, and we'll be also using a property called clear to achieve this layout. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna build off of what we started in our last video, which was this basic structure, and I'll go ahead and say basic page, basic float. And so we're going to have three boxes here. I'm going to add 2 more boxes. I'm going to add a header, and I'll give this header ID to keep my tag clean of head struct. Sure. And you can give that ID any name you want, but in this case, I just typically name it head structure, and I'll give this a footer. And I'll give this also an attribute here. I'll give it ID equals foot struct. Sure. So here I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 box elements to achieve desired look and feel of what you see here in this image. Now I'm going to use a number of different properties. One that you'll see here is going to be float, and I'll use the width and the height to give structure to the various box elements of my site. So let's begin to code this out. So we already gave structure to these 3 box elements, and we'll continue to work with those box elements. But let's go and begin to target our header and give our header some presentation. So we're going to target our header by its ID attribute. So we'll say pound pound head struct. Sure. And we'll give this a width, and I want this to take the 100% of the browser window, the viewport window. And the height, let's go ahead and give it 175 pixels. And just so we can see this here, we're going to give it a background color. Let's give it olive. Yeah, let's give it the olive color here, olive drab. Just so we can see the structures taking place. And I'm going to target our footer by its ID attribute. And in CSS, we use the pound sign and we say foot struct, sure. And I'll give that a width of 100%. And I'll give it a height of 170. Let's do it 150 pixels. And then here I'll say background color so we can actually see it show up on our site. Let's give it a dark gray. Now that's going to serve as our header and our footer. Let me just make a few adjustments to our boxes. So the width here, I'm going to do a percentage, right? I want to make this somewhat of a fluid website. So I'll say make this, each of those boxes should be 30, let's say 30% of the browser window. And we may adjust this here. And the height is going to be, yeah, let's keep the height at, let's say 700 pixels. The other thing I'm going to do here is because if I save this, the normal page, or what we call the default behavior here would be for the boxes to stack on top of one another. The only boxes that will not stack on top of one another is going to be the 3 boxes here. It's because we float those boxes to the left. But what I want to do here is I want to let's go and render this in the browser to see what we have thus far, and then we'll talk about some further adjustments. So to save that, right click, open in Chrome. And that's what we have thus far, is that we have our header and this olive drab, and our footer is right below the header. Now you'll see there's a number of things I can do to get this footer to be at the bottom of our web page. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to add a clear property. You could also use a property called display and begin to use some of the relative and fixed values for display. But in this, I'm sorry, the position property, you can say for the position property, you can use relative, fixed, absolute. But here, to fix this, I'm going to right click and I'm going to use a property called clear. And so in my footer, I'll say property clear, and I'll say both. And you'll see that now my footer is at the bottom where it should be, where it's supposed to be. And the reason why is because when you use the clear property, that means it's saying that nothing to the right or to the left of me can exist. And so the clear property says that box element can only exist on its own line. And so nothing to the right or nothing to the left. And so the clear property is one of those tricks where it actually pushes the footer down to the bottom of the web page. So here's a basic page layout structure. Like I said, it's very basic. We have a header, we have 3 columns, and then we have a footer. But the key to this here is the float property. So if I were to inspect this, what makes these boxes float next to one another is the property called float. If I were to take that off, right, you'll see that the default behavior is that the boxes stack on top of one another. And like I said, the whole idea of page layout is to make sure that it's to basically bring the various box elements that we have within our site into a particular formation. And so traditional float model plays on the float property as well as the width and the height of the box elements. If you're doing a fixed website, you would have to do the mathematical calculations for each of the boxes to get them to fit on a particular row. And that's what this slide here is referring to, is called drop columns. So if you didn't have the space for all of these 3 boxes to fit within this overall orange box, then that column is going to drop to the next row because there's not enough available space for it to be next to column 2 here. And so, like I said, if you're working with doing a fixed site, or a portion of your site is going to be fixed, you have to do the mathematical calculation to take in consideration the full width of the available space for each of your various columns that you'll have. So again, that's kind of the traditional float layout, where you have these various box elements To get these boxes to align next to one another, you're going to use the float property. In this case here, we said float left. You could say float right, and then begin to give these box elements some padding and margin to create some space in between them. But then here, our non-floating elements is the header and the footer. And then in the footer, to get that footer to drop down, we use the property called clear. And then we put both as the value, which basically says nothing to the right or to the left can exist next to this box. And here's a slide on the clear property, and kind of gives you an illustration of how that property works. And like I said, here, if you use the clear on the footer, it cannot exist to the left of the footer, so it's going to drop to the next line. Now, like I said, this is traditional float. You have to do the mathematical calculations to get the box elements to fit in your available space. But in our next video, we're going to tackle something called Css Flexbox. And essentially, it's indicative of its name in the sense that it's a better way of working with box elements in your site, where some of the properties that we'll be using will do some of the calculations on your behalf just by igniting Flexbox functionality into your site. And so stay tuned, and we'll begin to talk about CSS Flexbox in our next video.